Hello, and welcome to the next episode of Running with the Pack. I'm Paul Bishop, the acquisitions editor for Wolfpack Publishing, and with me today are two of my good friends, Richard Prosch and Eric Beetner, both who are writing for Wolfpack at this time, both who are writing for our new series, Legend of the Black Rose, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Hey, guys.
Hey there.
Hey, Paul.
Now, Eric, you're coming to us from beautiful downtown
El Segundo, California, right by the beach.
Okay, and Rich, you are?
Just outside Jefferson City, Missouri.
Okay, so long distance Zoom conversations have become the norm. But it's interesting because even though we're very far apart, as writers, we're very used to working remotely, even when we're working with other writers. You know, we go back and forth by email. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. Most of us are somewhat introverted. In fact, I like to say we've been training for this pandemic since we were born. So what is it like to work with writers from that perspective? Now, Eric, I know that you do your writer type podcast. Does that give you more of a connection or does that make it more difficult?
I think it helps a little bit. I draw, I think, maybe more experience on this kind of thing from my day job. I work in television as an editor and producer. And so I'm used to collaborating with a large group of people. And, you know, if you're on a series, obviously one person can't cut the whole thing. So you're all have several people making a unified product at the end, but you're farming out episodes to different editors. And, you know, so in a way, it's very similar to how we've structured these books where it's all under one umbrella, but everyone sort of gets their assignment and their marching orders and then goes off and does their own thing and comes back. And hopefully the end result is a cohesive whole.
Now, Eric and you and I first met when you were working as a story editor for Take the Money and Run, and I was the on-screen talent, as they referred to us, haha. And I think you and I have been around each other for like even a couple of episodes, and all of a sudden one day I looked at you and went, Eric Beetner, did you write Too Many Blows to the Head?
Yeah.
And you looked at me like, how does he know?
Yes, it was I remember that very well. We were in Chicago, deep in the bowels of a jail, and yeah, this came out. I was like, wait a minute, no one's heard of that book. And then I sort of was right back to you. I was like, wait, you're Bish's Beat?
Yeah, that was, and that actually led to some great collaboration on the Fart Card series of books and other works together that have been a lot of fun. Now, Rich, you and I have known each other for quite a while now, basically, but meeting through Wolfpack. And then, actually, I think we met earlier than that because I was doing some of your mystery novels, focusing on them on the blog. So then you came to Wolfpack a couple of years ago?
It's been a couple of years. Before that, I think we met actually through the Men's Paperback Book Club on Facebook, where we share a similar interest in adventure fiction and paperback collecting. So that's where I first saw your name.
Yeah, I think that Facebook group has a lot to answer for.
It does. It does.
I have spent more money on books because I found out about them there than anywhere else.
Yes.
It's a good group. But you go back and forth between your Dan Spalding mysteries, which are contemporary, and Westerns. How is that transition? Easy, difficult? How do you make that transition?
I think it's pretty easy, actually. I always kind of follow the Bill Kreider rule. You know, our old friend Bill Kreider, who wrote both Western and crime. And at one point, he said that many of the best Westerns are just crime stories set in a different historical period. And I think that's often true, especially with your traditional Western, with the gunslingers and things like that. So having a crime and then just somehow putting the trappings and settings around it, it's a pretty easy transition.
Okay. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about today was book packaging, because we're involved in that intimately, the three of us. And it really, with Wolfpack, it started with Mike Gray, the head honcho over there, coming to me and asking me to create some series Western series in particular, and then going out and finding the authors who would write the books in those series under the house name A.W. Hart. Now, this is something that was done a lot in the 60s and 70s, but in the 80s and 90s, it kind of trailed off. It's making a big comeback. And it's an interesting process when I come up with a series idea and then I go to you guys and say, here's this idea, what do you think? And then you put your stamp on it back and we go back and forth. But Eric, you were doing this before with Beat to a Pulp. You started writing Westerns there, isn't that right?
I did. They had a series of Westerns called The Lawyer. It started with a series of short stories that then they expanded out into the novella length. So they were, 25,000 word things. And I think there ended up being 7 in that series. I wrote 3 of them. And I think the third one actually never even came out. It's still sitting on a shelf somewhere, which breaks my heart because I was really proud of that. But it was the similar thing where, hey, here's this character, here's his backstory. We want to eventually lead up to, the culmination, which is X. It was a revenge story. Ultimately, he was sort of hunting the men who had done his family wrong. So you sort of have those kind of loose parameters, but then within that, you're allowed to play and you're allowed to be creative and sort of come up with your own plot for your individual story that tells that standalone story, but also advances the larger story along the way towards the conclusion, which is always, I think, the biggest challenge in getting an assignment like this is like, okay, I want to have my standalone story that I've come up with that I can get excited about, but also you have to incorporate the larger world that you're working in so you don't lose the thread along the way.
I think it's kind of akin to series television.
Yeah.
Where you have a writer's room and one writer goes in and pitches a story idea and everybody else kind of works it over and massages it, and then that writer goes away and writes that story. But I think that's particularly hard for the freelancers who come in because you can't change any of the major characters. You have to work within their world. And that sometimes presents its own difficulties because where you see a story might go for a dramatic point gets cut off because, oh, I can't do that with these characters because they've got to continue on. You can't kill somebody off, you can't marry them, you can't have them lose an arm, whatever it may be. They have to be the same at the end of the episode as they were at the beginning.
Right. I remember reading a story about Star Trek that the writers would come in, and it was probably a story about Harlan Ellison because he was typically, bucking that system. But the story that the crew has to end up on the bridge. They start out on the bridge and they end up on the bridge, and you can remember the scenes of the second season where they're back on the bridge and they're laughing and stuff. And there's always got to be a happy ending for that season. And that's tough sometimes because you get the characters and you think, I want to take this character and keep going with it. But in the end, they got to wind up back at the saloon or back at the sheriff's office or back, happy in the end and ready for the next writer to come in.
And to a certain extent, and I think it holds true in the book series that we packaged at Wolfpack, when you're writing for episodic television, there's a number of actors who are the secondary actors behind the star, but they've all got to have their lines. They've all got to be involved in the story. And if you don't involve them in the story, then the producers are going to come to you and say, involve them in the story because they're getting paid. So we need to have them on screen. And these guys count lines. So I think our fictional characters at least don't do that to us.
For the most part.
For the most part. Rich, you started with the package series with Avenging Angels, which we began a couple of years ago now. And that really, tell us about Avenging Angels and how that series came about for you.
Well, I thought it was a pretty neat premise. Now, did you work with Pete Brandvold on that? Or
yeah.
Did Pete kind of came up with that and brought it to you?
Actually, we worked on that together and then took them in different directions because we had 2 series that were similar in many ways and we had to differentiate between the 2. So Avenging Angels and Gunslinger, even though they both involve twins and are Westerns, had to go in different directions. So that was another interesting aspect when Mike Ray said to us, well, let's do both.
So the Avenging Angels is the story of Reno and Sarah, twins again, who they were growing up in Kansas, minding their own business when a horrible horde of Confederate, ex-Confederate renegade terrorists tear through the country and, of course, ravage their homestead and wipe out their family and leave Reno and Sarah to their own device, which the first thing they want to do, of course, is get revenge on the people who took away their life. And so Reno and Sarah set out and go for that revenge in the first book, but then after that, they're alone. They have to go, they have adventures. And it's a really interesting story because I think that you and Pete infused it with a lot of kind of a neat backstory of religion, in that their father was a pastor, and the whole idea that, you know, his last words were to tell them to go out and kind of cleanse the earth of bad people. And so they do kind of go out and seek out evil and root it out and try to destroy it. And that's the point of the book, is that they actually do go out and try to destroy it. Sarah, the female character, is much more bloodthirsty even than Reno, who is actually kind of more philosophical and tends to hold back and question sometimes what they do. I think it's a really interesting series.
And there was a fine line to walk with the religious aspect of those things, between making them justified, Reno and Sarah, and having them cross another line where they would not be justified. And when they came up against people who questioned their religious purposes and motives, it adds to complications for the story. And I think that's what gives the book the depth, is complications.
Absolutely.
And you have to have, whereas, as you said, Sarah is certainly less conscious than Reno, but Reno is her conscience because they're twins, and he's the one that has to kind of keep her in line and stop her from going off the rails. Now, Eric, you started in on the Gunslinger series, which we also started at the same time, and this has a set of twins in it too. But this was a far more complex family story than what we had in the straightforward adventure in Avenging Angels. And I think one of the challenges I gave you was, we're halfway through the first book. We haven't got it finished yet. We don't know where we're going. Start writing.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember, I think you had sent me maybe the first 50 pages or something that Mel had written, and it has such a slam bang open to that series where you know kind of everything you need to know about the main characters right off the jump. So I did feel like I had enough to go on, at least. And then about halfway through writing my book, which was book number 2, Killer's Fuse, you dumped the 50-page Bible on me that had me going back and doing a lot of revisions real quick. To like, oh, okay, because I mean, it was interesting to see. I hopefully readers can really appreciate how far thought out these things are. I mean, this is the kind of series that we're making these things to reward people sticking with it. It's not just a trilogy that you need to get to the end of. I mean, we're really planting seeds and Easter eggs and stuff that's going to pay off 8, 10, 12 books down the road. So the challenge, I think, for me with writing book 2 was there was this constant push and pull of like, and me sending you emails like, can I reveal this yet? Can we know this? Or, oh no, not yet. Okay, let's hold, so you would put in these things where I'm like, okay, if someone is paying attention, they'll recognize when they get to book 4 or 5, oh, okay, oh, they mentioned that one line back in book 2 that now is paid off. So to have to try to plant seeds that you're not really sure how they're going to pay off other than just this outline, that was a really tricky part of this whole process.
And I agree, because we knew that we were going to have a resolution to this, but we also don't like stories that don't resolve. So yeah. Each individual book had to resolve the story for that book, and then there was the little tidbits that were for the overarching story. The next book, they would move closer to their goal. And one of the things that came about in that series is that with Rivers, the gunslinger main character, we really don't know what his ultimate plan is. And part of that was we as the writers and creators didn't really know what how he was going to resolve the issues that he was facing.
Yeah.
And that kind of developed by working with the writers like yourself and Mel Odom and others, as we collectively came to see where we want to go with this. Mike Black is another guy who wrote a lot of books for the Executioner series and got on Gunslinger, and he really helped pick up the pace of that backstory, because he really had a clear vision of where he was going with it, and we were forced to go along for the ride.
Well, and it's tricky because jumping in early and jumping in with book 2, it's like at those first discussions, when the only thing I had to go on was the conversations that you and I were having. It's a tricky thing to bring in writers of different style. I mean, everyone's going to bring their own individual flair to it, obviously. And, I latched onto a couple of things that you said. Like at one point you said, like, and we want it to be like a little bit gothic and so, and I sort of was like, oh, okay. Oh, I'm going to have a spooky house on the hill. So, that you latch onto those things as you're sort of dreaming up your story. And sometimes, if you latch onto something maybe a little too hard that then you need to let go of, or something that takes it in a way, like you say, that now I turn in my manuscript, and then hopefully that now can inform the next and the next and the next, because you see one little turn of the story that then you go, oh, okay, oh, this actually can work later on down the road. So, I mean, from your point of view, overseeing the whole thing, it's got to be this constantly evolving thing as each new manuscript comes in.
And keep going through those manuscripts to keep the continuity straight, and as well as making sure everybody's telling the story in relatively the same style, because writers write differently.
Yeah.
Right? So that's part of the challenge of what I do as an editor. But I have to say, with Killer's Fuse, one of the things that you did was you did take the idea, excuse me, of this gothic overtones, this sense of dread. I kind of said it was like Dark Shadows in the Old West.
Right.
And so you gave us that feel of, here's this old house, this old mansion, here's this cloyingly sweet lady who is going to go south at some point,
right.
And her weird son, and all of those things that were very much inherent to the Gothic genre, which we don't see too much anymore. And that was kind of one of the reasons that we went that way, was to make it different from Avenging Angels. Now, with Avenging Angels, Rich, that really is a straightforward action-adventure series. Does that present a problem when it comes to, you've got to keep the action going?
Sometimes, because I think there was such a interesting backstory that I was really interested in. The like we had already talked about here, the complications between Reno and Sarah themselves, and Reno wanting to look out for Sarah in more ways than one. He wants to protect her, but at the same time he wants to rein her in, because she's out sort of out after the bad guys. He sometimes wants to protect the bad guys from her. And so I really liked that, and I would find that I'd written, sometimes maybe a whole chapter of dialogue between the two of them going back and forth, and I realized, okay, this is kind of probably going to need some action of some kind in here. So go back and figure out how that dialogue can then be added in, and that idea that I've got can be presented, but through the action and not through big chunks of just dialogue. And so I wanted to explore those things. But yeah, I also was always aware that Reno and Sarah, the reader expected a certain amount of action and adventure.
Okay. Now with Gunslinger, again, one of the other sides of that book was we were really beginning to deal with mental illness in the Old West, or in the Wild West, when it wasn't really understood, or people who went too far over the edge were put away in asylums and all of that kind of stuff, and that presented a challenge for our characters. Can you tell us a little bit about how you dealt with that, Eric?
Well, I thought it made a really interesting dynamic between Connor and Abby, the two young characters who are at the center of this thing, and Abby having these episodes that nobody really understands. Like you say, like it's not really understood, it's not diagnosed at that point for being what it is, but I think it added this great element of making Connor even more protective over her, but then also giving her these flashes of violence and these unpredictable moments where, if Connor was not ready to step up and do the deeds, sometimes Abby was the one who was going to step in, and which, very unlike a character I think that you see in a typical Western. And for the people in the scene, no one is going to expect this cute little redhead to all of a sudden lash out and be capable of these moments of anger. And, you know, and not understanding that this is actually something that is going to affect her the rest of her life, and it's probably going to get worse. And then also, you know, again, getting back to like planting the seeds, you know, when you realize, okay, this is something that she probably inherited. Well, who did she inherit it from? And now, okay, what are we starting to see the same traits in some of the other characters? And you can, you know, again, the astute readers can start to connect the dots a little bit as they go and start and, you know, thread this thing through with this mental illness that she's dealing with.
And I think it actually added to the Gothic air and the theme of those stories, because is she slightly schizophrenic? Is she bipolar? I think she's more bipolar than, you know, necessarily hearing voices, but she does have manic episodes and she does have depressed episodes. Mm-hmm. And, you know, they have to deal with that as it happens. And so I think that made that series kind of unique in that way.
Yeah, and it was fun to write, you know, in mine, you know, where she meets this old woman who really takes a shine to her and takes her in and sort of takes on this sort of motherly role. And to see Abby, you know, now that, because she's lost her whole family, and to see her turn and sort of latch on to this woman as a mother figure and someone, and, you know, against Connor trying to say, like, no, this lady's not right. There's something's going on here. And Abby's so desperate for a family and desperate for this, you know, figure in her life, where she's kind of turning a blind eye to that. But Connor, you know, is thinking, okay, this is going to go bad for me because I'm going to lose my sister. And I know the troubles that she's having, and, you know, so I think again, like he's threatened by all aspects of the outside world, that he's going to lose the one piece of family that he still has left, knowing that even if he keeps her to himself and he goes along, he still might lose her to this illness that is sort of slowly consuming her from the inside.
Now, both with Avenging Angels and with Gunslinger, they do have this element of coming of age stories. So with Avenging Angels, Rich, you've got two twin young bounty hunters. How do you walk that fine line between coming of age and maturity in what they do, and, you know, acting out as youngsters?
Right. It is a fine line to walk. And I tried, in the two books that I wrote for the Avenging Angels series, I tried to point out at least once in both manuscripts that Reno and Sarah were 18 years old, so that, you know, we didn't have any sense that we were dealing with younger people, minors that might be involved with any kind of sexual situation or violent situation like that. And then there still is, though, the fact that they are innocent in some ways, and this is their first experience in the world. So when something happens to them, whether it's a sexual situation, which was often the case with Sarah, where she would use her feminine wiles, and she would deliberately use her femininity to maybe pull in a bad guy and, you know, seduce him toward his ultimate end in some way. We had to be a little careful, or I felt like I had to be a little bit careful with how I handled that, because she's not necessarily a woman of the world that would know all of that, you know, and so she would maybe bungle it a little bit, or maybe Reno would be surprised by his sister, or shocked even, because of the mores of that time. And so I found that to be a fun challenge in a way, actually, to work through. And I think it resulted in some fun scenes for the reader.
I think so too. And one of the things that I think many of our readers look for in these books is they are definitely PG-13. And I think there was like bolded letters in the Bible that I sent you guys that said, you know, swearing is out, no F-bombs, no overt sex, all of those types of things, because we know that readers of Westerns really like and enjoy a clean read. And I think that, did you guys find that a challenge? Because I know that you have both written more harder-edged books. Eric, you especially have written more harder-edged books. Was that a challenge to pull that back?
You know, I think it was not as much of a challenge, and thankfully, I think part of that was my experience with Fight Card with you, Paul. You know, because those were the first things that I had written that were explicitly, you know, said these need to be PG-13, and that to me was very eye-opening, I think, and it helped me mature as a writer, because those novellas, the two that I did, are still some of my favorite pieces of writing that I've done. And it was a great education that, well, all that stuff, it can be just noise. It's completely unnecessary to the story you're telling. Like, if it's right for a character, then great. And I think since those books, I've employed it in that way in my own work, as like, well, okay, this is a character, and this is how that guy would talk, and it makes sense for that. But I don't need to gratuitously throw that stuff out there. And then in the same way, if you strip it out, you don't find anything's missing. And so I think with, with Black Rose, going through that, from knowing that from the beginning, there was never a point where I was like, oh man, if the bad guy could only, really drop an F-bomb here, we would really know he's a bad guy. No, you know who the bad guys are, you know who the good guys are, and you let their actions speak louder than their words. And so you get to the end, and I think if you don't explicitly mention it to someone who's looking for it, no one would even realize that it's not there, because you still get the action. I mean, there's a lot of bloodshed. Let's not kid ourselves about that. But so you can still have bodies dropping left and right. I don't need to describe the viscera, and I don't need to get into that deep into it. But you still get all the action you could ever want out of these books, and I don't think anyone's going to miss not seeing stuff that might throw another reader off and take them out of the story, which is what you never want.
Violence is one thing, but gore and viscera, as you said, is another, because you don't want to go down the horror path.
Right.
You don't want to cross over there. I just want to explain a little bit about what we're talking about when we're talking about a Bible. We're not necessarily talking about the Holy Bible scriptures. I don't send that to you and say, go through this and follow these guidelines and make my story. The Bible with a lowercase b is the background of the characters and the plot line, and the trying to answer all of the questions for how this in particular series is going to follow. So for me, with the Black Rose, now that you brought it up, our new series that we have coming up called Starting Out with Legend of the Black Rose, it all started when Mike Gray said to me, Paul, I need you to come up with another Western series. And right off my head, I went, okay, how about nuns with guns in the Old West? I'm like, thanks. He goes, I like it. Let's do it. Now I had to go, okay, what did I mean by that? So, I opened up the history books and do some research and looked up nuns on the frontier. And I was absolutely blown away by the stories of these women of God who were alone, working by themselves, working together, and taking on these humongous challenges that nobody knows about. I'm reading this stuff and I'm going, these guys, I don't have to come up with any plots. They're all here in the stories of these real life women and their dedication. And when we started thinking about the Black Rose and who she was going to be, I think I described her to you, Rich, originally as if Zorro and Xena, Princess Warrior, had a love child, it would be the Black Rose.
Right.
And I was hoping that would catch your imagination. And I think it did. Yeah. So with that, we knew it was going to be a revenge story. You came up with a lot of the other stuff. In other words, the caverns underneath the monastery where the nuns are and that type of thing. How did you get inspired by that original story idea and then help me increase the Bible?
I went online, as you did, and started to just do some basic research about these women that traveled across, usually from the East Coast, and would travel to California first, or then Arizona and Texas, and set up convents. And they often would set up convents in an old Franciscan monasteries or ruins or old churches. And then they would have a parish that was very small. And I think the thing that struck me was the natural, the man versus nature. The thing that they would have to come up against in real life often was just the harsh elements and the element of travel and what they had to put up with. So I started looking at some of that. What were some of the natural things they would have to face? We know there's bad guys, we know there's road agents, that sort of thing, but really in real life, in the Old West, historically they had to face just a lot of hardship as far as the natural elements. And in looking that up, I realized that, water, some of the basics of necessities of life, water, food, these are the things that they were concerned about. And if they could find a place where they could start a convent or set up a church where there were natural springs, that was a big benefit. And that kind of keyed in the idea of springs. And I came across a story about a blue nun. There is a true legend of the blue nun who appeared at a set of natural springs, and apparently to the believers still appears to this day sometimes to help people. And that really, I thought, was cool. So I wove that into the story as well. And that's kind of how that all developed, was from real life.
And I think we do take that from real life, but we then morph it through our writer's perspective and kind of mold it to the story ideas that we want. Now, one of the other things that I did with the Black Rose was I was insistent on her weapon, which was a urami, which nobody had ever heard of. None of the writers that I sent this book to were going, what in the world is that? I was having to send pictures and describing it. It is an old ancient weapon. It is a steel whip sword, and they're very difficult to use. They're very dangerous. But I did it because I wanted to make the character stand out from Zorro and Xena and all the others that you could put her up against. How did that work for you, Eric?
It was a lot of fun, and that was one of the first things that I did. Is I found you can find YouTube videos of because urami is a traditional Indian weapon, and so there's videos of people using them, and you could see right away how difficult this thing must be to wield. But it just made it this fascinating thing where it separated her. I mean, Lena is an outsider wherever she goes in these books. So I think to give her this element that was so outside of everyone around her was a great little character touch. And being able to have her wield this sword that, it can also be very unassuming. I mean, she wraps it around her waist like a belt. So it's like, she might walk into a room and people don't even know she's armed, and yet she's really deadly armed. Plus giving her this thing that is so difficult to use right off the bat. Okay, she's got these special skills. She's elevated. She's something else. This is someone that, you don't want to mess with, and she's going to surprise you. And if you're on the wrong end of this thing and this woman, look out.
Exactly. And I think that really, I think what you said there, it elevates her. It makes her a special character and makes her stand out. And I think that's what we're trying to do with that. And the other element is in the very early pages of the first book, she takes refuge, while she's being pursued at a monastery with an order of nuns who hide her. And she's about as far from a nun as you're going to get at this point. And some of the challenge was, okay, how much influence are they going to have on her? And we gave her a mother superior with a worldly background who basically manipulates the heck out of her. And how did you work with that dynamic, Rich?
Oh, I thought that was a stroke of genius on your part, because it allows us to have her be, as Eric said, elevated, a special person. But she's just like some of the other characters we've already talked about. She's also coming of age in her own way. She's young, 18, 19, 20 years old, and learning her she's got her skills, but she's also got to learn now how to be around other people. She's been not necessarily pampered, but maybe somewhat sheltered in her father's estate. And now that her father and family are gone, she has to learn how to survive in society too. And so having the mother superior that's got a bit of a background does help out a lot in helping be a guide or a mentor for her. And I really liked that because it allowed her to understand where Lena's character, or when Lena's character would do certain things or say certain things. It helped to have somebody there that would have some patience with her, but also could be firm and kind of almost in that parental role. So that was good. And it allowed us to do other stories then too, to go on from there.
And one of the things that actually surprised me when you wrote the first book is you have her make mistakes. She doesn't make mistakes necessarily with her weapons. And, you know, we have a good backstory for how she got hold of this ancient Indian weapon and that type of thing. We address those things, but you also, you know, she goes out on these adventures and she messes up sometimes. And that was really interesting to me. What made you go down there? That path?
Well, I do have a fairly limited background in martial arts. And, you know, when you're in the dojo and you're in a group setting, you'll see young people. And I see so many young people that are, you know, maybe 10, 11, 12 years old. They come into the dojo, they work with the sensei. And my background's in karate, Shotokan karate. So they would, you know, they would go up through the belt rankings and be expert at something. You know, they're earning their black belt, and wow, they're amazing and incredible. But oftentimes these kids don't necessarily have the maturity to know when to actually apply their talent or apply what they're doing. And so I thought about that a lot. I thought of that martial arts background and thought, you know, that's kind of where Lena's at. She's an expert with this Urami, but she doesn't know all the time when she should use it and when she shouldn't. So that's kind of where that came from. And I think that having the Mother Superior be there as sort of I think you and I talked about kind of a Jim Phelps role, Mission Impossible. You know, she's there to show the nuns where their next mission is, but also to guide them.
And I think that's interesting that you bring up Jim Phelps, because we have talked about this in conversations and this kind of Mission Impossible tie-in, because when Lena has an assignment from the Mother Superior, she has to go and find other nuns who have special skills, who are also willing, whether it be a builder or a fighter or whatever it is. There were these nuns that had tremendous skills. And Lena would kind of recruit them, and we ended up with what we were calling the Secret Order of the Black Rose. And they would have this burnt crucifix that identified them, and which gave us the little strange character of the crucifix maker and these types of things. Did you capture that element right away, Eric, when you saw what we were trying to do?
Oh yeah, I think you know, it's such a great longstanding Western thing of, you know, the band of strangers who comes together, you know, if it's the Magnificent Seven, it's, you know, it's all of the professionals, it's all of these, you know, great stories that we know and love. And I think, you know, like Richard was saying, like Lena, I think she knows her shortcomings, and she knows that she can't do this on her own. And she's also, one of the things I loved most about her is her reluctance sometimes to enter into these assignments that she's being given. But because she's got this pull within her to right the wrongs and to seek justice and to seek revenge in a lot of cases, and yet she's conflicted by it because, you know, she has to go out and commit violence, and she has to do these things that, you know, play on her conscience a little bit. So when she can bring in allies who are there to supplement the skills that she doesn't have, but also to create a bit of a team mentality and to support her. And, you know, I ended up being a group of 4, Lena and 3 others in my book. And they prop each other up sometimes. Like if someone is feeling like this is hopeless, then somebody else is there to tell them that, no, it's not. If someone's feeling like, oh, this is the wrong thing, you know, should we go out and, you know, with the intent to kill, a lot of times, like, yes, this is the right thing. These men need to be stopped. If we don't, then this is the horrible thing that will happen. So the women all band together and really support each other, you know, and they almost become these kind of feminist Westerns in a way, because it's these women who are leading the charge to right the wrongs. And, you know, they might get help from men along the way, but it's definitely women front and center, you know, leading the charge, doing these things that have been typically, especially in Western fiction, have been typically male roles.
Now, Rich, one of the other things that we were confronted in with this was, how are we going to treat the church? and religion as part of this story, because obviously the priests were really the people in charge of this area. And we just didn't want to go down the road of all bad priests. We wanted to have this kind of blend of that would be even-handed. How did you address that when you began to write this story in your head? What were you thinking about?
Well, the mission at Santo Tomas is overseen by Father Andronicus, and I immediately saw Andronicus as a bad guy. At first, maybe more like a Dr. Smith character from Lost in Space, something kind of a mischievous character maybe who was just ornery, just causing trouble so that he could maybe benefit somewhere along the way. But then as I wrote the first book and got into the second book, I saw him more as probably a pretty evil character. And that's where he sat in my head, whereas the younger priest that comes in the second book, Father Demetrius, is probably more of a good guy. But I didn't focus a lot on the priests. I focused on the nuns, and one of the things I really tried to do was to think about these nuns, and some of the characters that work with the Black Rose are nuns who have taken their vows. Others are not. Others are still young novices in the order. Maybe they're not even novices. Maybe they're like Lena, and they're just young women who have been taken in by the convent, who are living at the convent, and the Mother Superior has added them to the team, to the Order of the Black Rose. So I would often try to make sure that the characters that were nuns, like the sister that is the analyst who records everything, she is very much against killing anybody. She tries to stop the others from killing people, and if somebody does end up dying, she's the one that demands on a proper burial and things like this. She's by the capital B Bible. She's the one who wants to go by that. Whereas then I would have the characters who had not taken vows be the ones who could instigate the violence and be more involved with that. So that wasn't always the case, especially in the second book, but I tried to keep that in there so that I'll be honest, I've got a very good Catholic friend who's a deacon at the local parish, and I have coffee with him probably every 3 weeks or so. And he said one day, "What are you working on?" And I told him about this, and he said, "Well, you better keep those nuns clean. They might have guns, but be sure." And I thought, wow, there will be a day that he'll read this book, and I'll have to kind of answer to him over coffee. So I kind of kept that in mind.
Rather answer to him over coffee than answer to God on Judgment Day for the way you portrayed his nuns, right? The Brides of Christ.
Right.
Eric, one of the things that's been fun working with you over the time period that we've had together, a number of years now, is that when we're discussing stories back and forth, I think there have been a couple of times when, like in your first Gunslinger book, I said stuff needs to blow up more. And in the finale. And I think in your Black Rose book, I said the words leper colony. That's very small input, but when you're working collaboratively like that, is that a great way of sparking your own imagination?
Yeah, I think you do it very well, because my whole day job, getting back to that, is I do a creative thing in editing these TV shows, and then I hand it off to executives and I get notes. So my whole world is just doing something creative and then being told how to do it better or how to do it differently or how I did it wrong. So the constructive notes give you a way forward. And I've worked with a lot of execs and stuff who give you something like, "I don't like it." Like, okay, well, what didn't you like about it? Well, I don't know, but it's not this. So, when I hand in an outline to you and you can say, needs more of this, but you're not trying to say, "Here's what you do. Have the guy walk in here and then he finds this and then he goes over." Like you're giving me the freedom then to open it up and to use something that could be as vague as, I see a leper colony for some reason. And I go, all right, let me try to see a leper colony, and then you give me the freedom then to integrate that into the story that I've already developed and to do it organically. So I'm not trying to just ratchet something on as an addition to something else. You end up with this sort of Frankenstein thing. So I love that kind of feedback, because in that early development process, while it's still an outline, there's no bad ideas. And if I'd gone down that road and I came back to you a week later and I said, Paul, I just don't know how to get a leper colony in there. It just won't work. I'm sure you would have said, well, next book, So I don't mind being vague, because it lets the creative person be creative.
And I think that what you just said there about, we'll save that for the next book. I'm a firm believer in keeping my writer's treasure chest full. In other words, ideas that really don't mean anything at that exact moment, like the Urami. I've known about the Urami weapon for 10 years or more. And there was never a right moment to use it until we created the Black Rose. Now's the time to take that out of the treasure chest and spend that idea. And the same thing with the leper colony. It was, this kind of fits somewhere in these stories, because the nuns worked in leper colonies and those types of things. You're right, it may not have been right for that particular story, but we would have kept that, because somewhere down the line we would have used that in a Black Rose story. Fortunately, you took it and ran with it, and you didn't realize I was just messing with you. No, I'm just
Well, but it did. I mean, it added this great extra layer, and even as simple as an explanation as you gave of that, I immediately could see it, because I think the thing that we discussed is, the leper colony is there, but it can't just be there. Like, they have to be then integrated into the story. And this idea of what if you have a scene, we both sort of had the same image, like, okay, I see them, a horde of these lepers walking down the street, almost like zombies coming at you. And it's like, okay, yes, I can work with that. Like, immediately that's in my head, and I'll find a way to make this work. And like you say, I mean, the novel of my own that I'm in the middle of writing right now, I had written a line in a song lyric back when I was in a band, mid-90s this is, and it was always like, this is one of the best lines I've ever written. It just had a certain poetry to it. Always been in the back of my head, waiting for the moment that I can deploy this in a novel. Finally, in this book, I think this will be my 30th book that I'm writing right now. Here it is. I'm going to drop that in. So it just one line, but it was stuck in there. Like you say, it was in the treasure chest, and you wait until the right time to use it. And hopefully that was the perfect moment, and it sings off the page right in that little moment.
With the Black Rose, we are so excited about this concept, and we kept building on it and building on it. And as we all talked, and with you guys and with the other writers that are on the team, and we came up with these plots and these stories, and we're seeing this in our heads as this grand Western shoot 'em up adventure. And then it came time to do the covers for this book. And I think Rich and I in particular kind of looked at each other and went, how do we show readers that this is a Western? How do we capture that this is the Western that they're going to love and enjoy? And that's been, frankly, quite the challenge. And we've gone through 2 or 3 artists until we finally come up with a concept that we think is going to work for us to show this Zorro-like character, but not as a comic superhero, but as a real Western entity. And I think that's one of the things that we really want to make sure that Wolfpack Western readers are aware of, is that when they pick up a copy of the Black Rose, Stories, Legend of the Black Rose, Sword of the Black Rose, Siege of the Black Rose, and the others in the series, that they are going to get the Western action that they're expecting. And I think that has been one of the hardest things for us to translate. But I think we're finally being successful.
I loved the concepts I've seen so far. It looks. I'm immediately grabbed by the image. I mean, just the Black Rose herself, and the way that we've designed her face paint and sort of her costuming, like you say, in almost that Zorro sort of way. Like it's immediately an arresting image that I think people will be drawn to.
And again, we had to get past the conceit of the Zorro mask, right? So we had to find a way around that, and using Apache war paint as her mask. I mean, masks are conceit in themselves, you know, throughout fiction. So you have to kind of do something a little bit different with it. I mean, you know, Clark Kent, he puts on those glasses and he's just Clark Kent. He takes them off and nobody recognizes him anymore because he's got his glasses on. So to a certain extent, you have to work with a suspension of disbelief, your willing suspension of disbelief of your readers. And so, but we also didn't want her to be the Lone Ranger. So giving her this Apache war paint really seemed to do the job. Rich, you were going to say something else about the covers?
I was going to talk about the time frame. I think that part of what we're looking at with the Legend of the Black Rose and all the books is that, you know, if you go back and think about the Wild West, usually 1920 is the cutoff, especially in literature or in traditional Westerns. You know, anything that goes beyond 1920 isn't necessarily considered a Western. Even if it happens in the West, then it's more like a contemporary Western. So with the Legend of the Black Rose, it is a Western adventure, but it's right on the edge of that, you know, 1910, 1911 time frame. In fact, Paul, you and I talked about our favorite, one of our most favorite series, of course, is the Fargo series by John Benteen, Ben has. And, you know, this is a chance. I jumped at this because this is a chance to write a character in that Fargo time frame of the early 19-teens, the late 1910s, when, you know, everything was in transition. Everything was changing. You can have horses right next to automobiles, and you can even have an airplane fly overhead if you want to. Everybody's going to be a little excited about an airplane, but they did exist. And so, you know, if we use some of those things, if we use an automobile or we use an airplane or something, you know, everybody also has to know this is still, there's still a lot of Western adventure. There's still horses and six guns and all of that action. But there's a really unique spin on that, though, too, that I think really adds to the series.
And one thing that we also want our listeners to this video to know, and also our readers, is that we publish these books all under the A.W. Hart house name because it unifies the series together. Now, you as the individual authors, you do get credit on the title pages. But the idea is, in the book selling world today, we want you to be able to find all of these books in one place, and that's under the A.W. Hart name. And I think that binds the three series that we have now. We have, you know, Avenging Angels, Gunslinger, now Legend of the Black Rose, and the upcoming Concho series, which is a contemporary Texas Ranger series. All of those are written by great authors like you, and yet we're putting them out under this house name, umbrella name, so that we all benefit from that, both the authors and the readers, when it comes to being able to find these terrific stories. Well, thank you, guys. I appreciate all of you hanging out with me here today. I appreciate even more the fact that when I call you up with crazy ideas, you guys immediately jump on board. So thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you both.
Thank you, Paul.